Hey everyone, today I'm going to be producing what is probably my most technical and analytical video in this channel's history. I'm pretty excited. We're going to be talking about every single legendary weapon archetype in the Destiny 2 endgame PvE sandbox, and the goal of today's video is going to be to make all archetypes exist for a purpose in the sandbox without having a clear, better version. So my goal isn't to make all archetypes strictly equal. That's a very big ask. Maybe we can move in that direction today. I'm not going to make any super crazy, significant, radical changes to the sandbox, but I am going to try my best to balance things a little better, diversify the sandbox a bit, and make it a little bit more exciting to play for players of all experience levels. So there are two angles from which we can approach this sandbox talk. First is weapon families against each other. For example, like linears against machine guns. Those are two weapon families that we can compare. We can say, hey, are linears intruding on the role of a machine gun in the sandbox, whether it's damage profile, range, whatever it is. There's a bunch of different reasons why weapon families might be worth comparing against each other. And of course, we also have the other angle, which is archetypes within families. So we might argue, is the support frame auto rifle power creeping other auto rifle archetypes like the high impact or the rapid fire? We can discuss that, we can talk about it, and if we do think so, then we can maybe make some tweaks to certain archetypes within families as well. So the structure of this video, I'm going to briefly talk about my methodology. We're going to go over analysis where we look at trend lines and outliers for all the different weapon families, and then we're going to move on to a section of the video where I make extremely concrete and specific numerical suggestions for changes to most, if not all, of the archetypes in the game to make them feel a little better to play, whether it's for a Bungie audience or for just my community or the community at large to look at and discuss so that we can have an interesting conversation about this topic, because a lot of Destiny content creators and data scientists, as I like to call them, spend a lot of time making objective measurements, analyzing PvP TTKs, boss health values, boss damage values, all these sorts of things, but I don't think a lot of time is actually spent interpreting those values. You know, we hear people say all the time, oh, linears need a buff, or, you know, shotguns shouldn't do this much damage, or fusions should do more damage, but we never talk about how much exactly. If you were in the position of a game dev, and you had access to all the knobs, you could tweak the fire rates, you could tweak the per shot values, you could tweak the ammo counts, what would you do? Down to the number, what would you do? And so today, I'm going to attempt to make a bridge across that gap between the player base who is asking at a subjective level for certain weapons to feel better, to feel balanced, and the objective, the data level, where we have the numbers, we have the access, we know why weapons feel like they should kill red bars faster or they should do more boss damage. I'm going to try to bridge that gap and create a sandbox where if I was a game dev, or if we were all game devs and we had access to all the different knobs and tweaks, what could the sandbox look like on this data-driven basis? With that long intro out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about methodology next. So how did I actually get the minor, elite, and boss DPS columns here? How did I get these values? So everything here is actually based off the boss DPS column. These numbers are then multiplied by scalars for minors and elites sourced from Mossy's outgoing damage spreadsheet, which if you're interested in damage specifics, you should definitely go take a look at that as well. I've linked it in the description as per usual. For the special and power weapons, these values come from my boss DPS spreadsheet where I measured shot-to-shot boss DPS for all of these weapons. So what does shot-to-shot mean? For those of you that don't know, that's a term I also use in the boss damage spreadsheet. If you were to take some weapon like a rocket sidearm and you shot 2 shots back to back, you measure the time window between those 2 shots, and then you also take the damage value of 1 shot, you divide it by the time window, and that's your shot-to-shot value. Basically, it's the DPS of the weapon if you ignore manual reloads, if you're able to shoot the weapon just indefinitely. For a lot of special and power weapons, this is a realistic value to take on because that is often how these weapons are used. Now, the exception is rockets. Obviously, rockets, you don't shoot 10 or 11 or 12 rockets in a row without reloading unless you have something like slide shot or some sort of glitch. So because of that, rockets actually use the manual reload value here with Lunafaction boots, so like 100 reload. But obviously, in a lot of scenarios, you're going to be doing something that's in between. You're going to be doing maybe like a swap DPS rotation with a rocket, or maybe using Reconstruction or Envious, so you have some portions of your reserves where you're actually shooting back to back, but not your entire reserves, right? So just keep that in mind. The rocket DPS value here under the boss DPS column is disproportionately lower than the other power archetypes here. Just be aware of that. Obviously, when I was doing my balancing decisions later on in this video, I did take that into account, but that's something that you should just be aware of if you're looking at the spreadsheet on your own time. Now the primary DPS numbers, I actually don't measure primary DPS. I don't do primary DPS testing. So I had to rely on Xbox User 123's Quantum Damagix or DamageX spreadsheet. Definitely go check that out if you're interested at a more comprehensive look at the Sandbox, including primaries. His spreadsheet includes a sustained DPS value, which focuses on using primaries, but with 100 reload in between. So using manual reloads with max reload in between every single mag. That is a realistic way to look at primaries. That is how primaries are used compared to something like a special or a power weapon. So I decided that was the route I was going to go. Boss DPS, elite DPS, minor DPS for primaries, they're all calculated with manual reloads with 100 reload in mind. Now the total damage numbers here, these were calculated by looking at the highest max reserves example of any and all archetypes that are listed here. So for example, all special GLs basically get 25 ammo now, so that's what I decided to put. I put 25 ammo for all of these. Another example, adaptive heavy GLs. I know Cataphract, I believe, gets one more shot than something like an Edge Transit, so that's just something to be aware of. This is just the highest example of a weapon in every single archetype that I could find that doesn't use something like Field Prep or Enhanced Chain Reaction to bypass what you would get with a triple reserve mod setup. Ammo-based weapons here are all graphed using total damage and boss DPS on 2 axes, whereas primary weapons were just graphed using minor DPS, and I'll show you that in just a second here when we move on to graphs. So we have the DPS values, we have the total damage values. What does it look like when you actually punch in the numbers? So I decided to graph all of these archetypes. For special and power weapons, we graphed boss DPS against total damage on the Y and X axes, whereas for primary weapons, since they don't have any ammo constraints or total damage, it's infinite, we just graphed minor DPS because that kind of makes sense when it comes to comparing them. And finally, we also did linear regression analysis on all the ammo-based weapons in order to examine archetype differentiating design within weapon families. So what does that mean? Basically, if you look over here, this green dotted line, right, this is like the sword trend line. And if you see here, some examples like vortexes and waves are either vastly underperforming or vastly overperforming compared to what we would expect from an average sword based on this trend line. And based on this analysis, we can kind of look at certain archetypes and rein them in and say, hey, you're performing a little too much given how much total damage you do, etc., etc. And now for the fun part, analysis. So how do you actually read this graph with all its X's, dots, and lines? Well, just a disclaimer, we're going to ignore weapon identity for now. So what do I mean by weapon identity? Let's say you're a game dev and you're comparing machine guns and swords, and you're like, well, machine guns on average should do 15% less DPS than a sword because a machine gun is designed for ad clear, not boss DPS, yada, yada, yada. We're not going to think about it like that for now, because that sort of thinking ties more into the conclusion section, the suggestion section of this video. We're just going to focus on general visual observations from graphing, whether we're looking at clustering, trend lines, slope, outliers, whatever it is. We're just going to look at some general visual observations for now. Now, in terms of how to actually read this graph, you have the y-axis boss DPS and the x-axis boss total damage, which means anything that's more towards the top right corner of the graph is going to be good because it does high DPS and total damage, and anything toward the bottom left corner of the graph is not going to be so good. Now, generally, linear regression analysis should result in a negative slope in all of these trend lines, as higher total damage archetypes should lose DPS from a balance perspective, and that's generally how things go. I mean, look at machine guns, for example. Machine guns have a flatter-ish slope of their trend line, and you can see the highest boss DPS archetype, rapid fire machine guns, have the lowest total damage, and as you can see, as you get higher and higher and higher in total damage, you lose DPS until you reach high impact frame machine guns. Now, those of you who are clever might notice that this means more sharply negative trend lines mean that higher DPS archetypes within that weapon family get more overall performance value. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that in the case of rockets, for example, this kind of light blue line here, you can see that the trend line of this family is steeper than machine guns, which might indicate why people are less favorable towards the archetypes that do lower rocket DPS, for example, precision and high impact rockets. The community has really negative sentiment about that, but it's one thing to feel a way about a weapon, but it's another thing to be able to actually visualize why these consequences matter more for rockets than for something like a machine gun. You can literally see that a rocket is disproportionately punished for going up in total damage versus DPS. That compromise is more significant for rockets than it is for something like a machine gun. And these other archetypes, they're pulled up and down by outliers. So we're going to talk about those when we get there, especially heavy GLs. These are positive. It doesn't make any sense. So we're going to talk about those when we get there. But for now, I just hope this kind of helps you understand my visual observations when we start talking about individual archetypes going forward. Let's start by talking about power weapons, specifically drum GLs. Now, drum GLs have the highest base DPS in the sandbox by far, ignoring rocket swap and overflow potential like we talked about, but for some reason the trendline slope for heavy GLs is positive even if you ignore this precision frame outlier which we talked about last video. And that's because for some reason for heavy GLs, the stronger the archetype, the higher the DPS and the total damage at around 20,000 extra DPS per million total damage. Now, this trendline isn't the real trendline here because in Tableau I wasn't able to exclude this data point, but if you actually go to the endgame analysis spreadsheet and you check my slope function here, which does exclude precision frame heavy GLs, you can see that this value is around 20,000 DPS gained per million total damage gained, which doesn't really make any sense. Now, a slope that's this far off the negative that it should be is indicative of one of two problems. Number one, there's too few archetypes for the trend line to be realistic, which you could argue for here. But number two, if you actually look at the spacing between these three, and this is the general visual observation like I was talking about earlier, this cluster is really tight. There is not enough distinction between the heavy GL archetypes for it to really make a meaningful trend line. And even if you were to try to make a meaningful trend line without this dot, it's clearly going to end up being positive. So heavy GLs are a little odd in their archetype distinctions, and they definitely do need some more differentiation. Next up, we have linear fusions. Now, linear fusions actually do worse than manually reloaded rockets and swords and rapid fire snipers. I can actually show you rapid fire snipers right now. We go to sniper rifle. You can see sniper rifles, rapid fire snipers are right around here. Linear fusions are below that, right? So bit odd for a power weapon to be underperforming versus like manually reloaded rockets and special weapons, which is a bit weird. But I didn't do any regression work here. This trend line is just purely visual. Because there's only two samples here. There's only precisions and adaptive bursts, and precision frame linears, their total damage is heavily impacted by 4 times the charm. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but none of these archetypes take into account ammo boosting perks like triple tap and 4 times the charm. So this X over here would be shifted way over here, and the slope would become negative realistically if you're using a precision linear with 4 times, which you should be. Those are the good precision linears, obviously. But I didn't want to account for any perks when I was making this kind of spreadsheet and this graph. So yeah, that's why the trend line, the regression analysis is not particularly useful for this particular weapon family. Now, machine guns probably have the most well-defined role in terms of heavy weapons, and that's because they're just for ad clear, they're not really for boss damage. As for total damage, they already have pretty good total boss damage if you do end up using them for boss damage for some reason, but this scales even better, disproportionately better compared to the other archetypes, because machine guns actually have one of the highest minor scalars in the game at 1.94 times relative to boss damage. So really great stuff, very powerful ad clear performance. Most other heavy weapons for reference have like a 1.3 or a 1.5 times multiplier to minors. Other power families are a lot worse than machine guns. Finally, the last note I wanted to make here is if we go to the bottom of the experimental tab, machine guns actually have a flatter than normal trend line at a minus 11,000 DPS per million total, and that indicates to us a small thing like we mentioned earlier, that the better performing machine guns are going to be the ones that are on the right side of the graph rather than the left side of the graph, which is part of the reason why I think a lot of people prefer to use something like a high impact or an adaptive LMG over something like a rapid fire outside of subjective field circumstances. Now, rockets are a little interesting. They have the most negative trendline slope here at about minus 19,000 DPS per million total damage gained, indicating a disproportionately large decrease in DPS for higher total damage archetypes, which kind of reflects community sentiment like we mentioned earlier around precision and high impact rockets, and also they kind of have rather pitiful total damage. I'm talking about all rocket archetypes here, considering the requirement for Gjallarhorn. Rockets actually lose a quarter-ish of their damage when you take away Gjallarhorn or Pack Hunter from them. And so even with Pack Hunter, this is with Pack Hunter including swords, swords also include Pack Hunter in their total damage numbers, but the DPS is, it's fine once you consider the fact that this is manual reloads, but when you consider the fact that these are weapons that essentially cannot be used solo to the same extent, and require your teammates to sacrifice their total damage to buff your total damage, you can see they're still pretty much on the left side of the graph here, which means they have the lowest total damage of most of the heavy weapon archetypes, which is a little bit interesting. Now, swords are going to be the last heavy weapon family that we analyze here, and you'll notice that the trend line is actually positive, something that I said shouldn't really be the case outside of a few edge cases. And the edge cases here are actually going to be the waveframe sword and the vortex frame sword, which vastly overperform and underperform compared to where you would expect them to go for a heavy weapon archetype within the same family as something like an adaptive or a caster, etc, etc. And so the sword trend line actually is around 2,000 DPS gained for every million total damage gained because of this this waveframe outlier in particular, but just so you know, waveframes, they don't actually reach this level of DPS. The DPS cycle time value that I use for the waveframe 1 heavy 2 light combo is way faster than you would realistically be able to hit a boss even with very high charge rate. So you can just assume that waveframes are a positive outlier, but not by this much. And so when we go to our balancing decisions later on in this video, that will be taken into account. Waveframes will still be an outlier compared to the other stuff here, but this is much more of a theoretical performance compared to the other X's that you see here. These are a lot more realistic to hit and don't require any airtime, and don't really vary depending on boss model. I will say though, generally looking at the graph, most swords are in a decent place right now if we compare them to other heavy weapon families. Remember, we're not talking about archetypes right now, we're talking green X's versus yellow X's, red X's, blue X's. How are they looking? Swords generally look pretty healthy. I would expect them to be around here on the graph in terms of clustering based on their compromise and kind of how swords function in the sandbox right now. I think they do have a distinct niche kind of carved out for them in terms of both total damage and boss DPS. Let's go ahead and talk about special weapons next. Now, special weapons, I'm going to leave traces and rocket sidearms for the minor DPS discussion because they're not really used for boss DPS. So let's go ahead and start by talking about breach grenade launchers. Now, breach GLs, as you can see here, relative to the other colors, are huge underperformers even when you account for their multi-hit potential, aka being able to splash and hit multiple adds, especially certain archetypes like waveframes and area denials. Now, top archetypes of the breach GL family, for example, double fires and micro missiles, they actually have similar minor DPS to glaives, and glaives are a strictly defensive weapon. So this is a little concerning for breach GLs, and we're certainly going to revisit this comparison when we talk about what we're going to do to breach GLs to make them feel a little bit more balanced, a little bit more healthy for the current sandbox. Fusion rifles are next. Now, fusion rifles do kind of occupy their own region on the graph here, which is a good sign. That is a visual observation that we're looking for, a visual pattern we're looking for during this segment of the video. But if you want the math, they do approximately 63% of the DPS of a shotgun if we're comparing rapid archetype to rapid archetype. Their total damage looks all right, given that their DPS is compromised, and I would say rapid fire fusions and precision fusions in particular are large outliers, while the rest of the fusions seem to be following a relatively straight line. Next up, we have glaives. Now, glaives actually increase in total damage as they go up in DPS, and I wouldn't consider any of these glaives to be huge outliers in terms of special performance or special frames. So these are one of the only weapons in Destiny in general where Bungie has intentionally increased their DPS as the total damage goes up on the archetypes. They also do around 45% of a rapid fire shotgun DPS at most. No outliers really, and a slightly positive trend line, but not much else to say here. We'll talk about why this is the case, maybe from a Bungie dev's perspective perhaps, and maybe discuss whether this is the right way to go when we talk about rebalancing glaives a little bit. But in my opinion, glaives are mostly balanced, but I think doing around half of the optimal DPS of a boss damage archetype is kind of like realistic for glaives, given that they're a defensive weapon. I don't actually particularly have any problems with glaives right now. The sandbox is just not really molded well around them, doesn't really have a place for them, but in terms of stats and damage profile, I think they're okay. They're in an alright place. Next, we have shotguns. Now, shotguns, as you can see, kind of dominate the top segment of this graph here. Maybe you're a little surprised to see how well snipers kind of mingle with shotguns. Maybe you expected to see snipers a little lower, but they did recently get a PvE buff, those snipers, especially rapid fires. So we're going to talk about that in a second, but let's talk about shotguns first. Shotguns would have a more predictable flat trend line that kind of all of these points would kind of pass through, if not for one archetype, the rapid fire shotgun, right? Rapid fire shotguns are vastly overperforming. However, the problem with just looking at this analysis without context is that rapid fire shotguns obviously have a similar mag size to a lot of the other shotgun archetypes in this list. And because their fire rate is so high compared to the other archetypes here, your time to dump your mag is going to be a lot faster. And so you run into the problem where it's kind of like rockets, where rockets, you know, if you take them and you use manual reload values, the DPS tanks. But if you take them and use shot-to-shot values, the DPS is way higher than realistic. And so rapid fires kind of run into that same problem, although obviously their mag size is like 8, so it's not as relevant as something like a rocket, but still just keep that in mind when you're analyzing this DPS. This DPS is shot-to-shot, and realistically, you're going to be dumping your mag a lot faster than the other shotgun archetypes here, so that's just something to keep in mind with rapid-fire shotguns. The other outlier I would say is lightweights. Lightweights, for whatever reason, do lower DPS than rapids, which is to be expected, but they also have lower total damage, damage, which is kind of unexpected. So realistically speaking, we would probably see rapids shift over here and move the lightweights further to the right for balancing purposes, but we'll talk about that in the next segment of this video. Finally, we have sniper rifles. Now, sniper rifles, we only have 3 data points here, only 3 archetypes, so realistically, you're not going to be able to see outliers very well here, but let me just show you something, right? This massively negative trend line here is indicative of the fact that something is a huge outlier compared to the typical special weapon performance when it comes to damage profiles changing as you go up in total damage, and that's going to be specifically the rapid fire sniper here. If you envision a trend line that's more typical, something like a shotgun or like a fusion rifle trend line, you would see here that these 2 sniper rifles are kind of in line with where you would expect them to be in the angle, the slope of the trend line, but this rapid fire sniper is a huge positive outlier. So definitely when we go to adjusting this and making this trend line look a little more normal and not punishing the higher total damage archetype so much and favoring rapid fires, because this trend line, by the way, it's like minus 86,000 DPS per million total, meaning that rapids are hugely favored here. Like we talked about in the power weapon examples when we're looking at machine guns, we said, oh yeah, high impact machine guns are favored because the slope is so flat. This slope is extremely negative, right? Which means that rapid fire snipers are hugely favored when it comes to damage profile value here. So overall, though, I would say if we're comparing like the yellow cloud to the blue cloud to the orange cloud, etc., I would say snipers are maybe a little strong given their range capabilities. I mean, they're flirting with like some of the higher damage profile shotgun archetypes, which is maybe a little cause for concern, but then again, I'm not too upset about it given that snipers are relatively niche. Even the rapid fire sniper, which has a pretty strong damage profile, is generally not a first choice for most people in most loadouts and endgame content. So again, not super concerning, but it is pretty interesting to see them mingling with some of these shotgun archetypes here. Finally, let's talk about primary adjacent weapons and minor DPS. So first off, let's talk about some of the specials. So trace rifles right now look pretty weak compared to where they should be. For reference, a heavy burst pulse rifle does around 26.5k minor DPS, whereas a trace rifle does 26.2, and that's ignoring trace rifle manual reloads while including pulse rifle manual reloads. So trace rifles look quite weak, lower DPS and range than heavy burst pulses. Yeah, pretty questionable stuff. Let's look at rocket sidearms next. So rocket sidearms, you can see here, they kind of stand alone when it comes to primary and special ammo options for ad clear. They have 42.4k minor DPS, which is very high. They have pretty good high total damage, but I do think they kind of exist in a niche on their own, and I don't think their DPS is particularly what's super strong about them. I think it's their ease of use and their crazy ammo economy. So we're definitely going to look at balancing those factors a little bit more, but in terms of minor DPS, I do think if you pulled them down anymore, they would probably feel a lot worse and perhaps not so distinct of a role compared to some of the legendary primaries and other special ad clear archetypes that we have listed here. Finally, I'm going to talk about breach GLs. Breach GLs, I mean, waveframes at 18.5k, that's under half of the minor DPS of a rocket sidearm, meaning that efficiency-wise with a waveframe, you're always going to need to hit more than 2 enemies on average to reach parity in terms of ammo efficiency with a rocket sidearm, and that's ignoring the fact that rocket sidearms have much higher theoretical total damage. So waveframes, we might need to look at those from a balancing perspective. Area denial, you can make the argument that it's way easier to hit more ads with area denials than it is to hit them with something like a rocket sidearm, and of course you do have that lingering effect as well compared to waveframes, which only hit once. So that's a discussion for the next section of the video, but something to keep on the mind for sure. Next up, we have all of our primary ammo weapons. So as of right now, the way the sandbox is right now, scouts, SMGs, autos, and bows kind of all occupy the same primary DPS range. You can see here, you have autos the pink, you have bows the brown, you have scouts which are yellow, and then you have the SMGs which are dark blue. Now this is kind of odd because I would say some of these options are definitely more risky than others, some of them are more annoying to use than others, so it doesn't really make sense that their minor DPS is all in the same range. And then if you look at the other primary archetypes, you have lightweight sidearms which are a huge outlier at almost 31k minor DPS, which is pretty crazy compared to all the other dots on my screen right now. I know they're pretty small, so hopefully this is kind of semi-visible on mobile. When we actually change these graphs to show pre versus post patch, the dots will get a lot bigger, but unfortunately I'm unable to change the size of these dots right now without making them insanely oversized in the next section of the video. In terms of the other damage tiers, you can see hand cannons here are a bit above that 4-member group that I was mentioning earlier, this bottom tier, and then it goes pulse rifles, and then it goes sidearms on top of that. So this is kind of just a reference point for you guys to understand what the sandbox looks like right now, regardless of range and feel factors. In terms of raw primary minor DPS with 100 reload, it goes sidearm, then pulse, then hand cannon, and then the other 4 primary weapon families really don't have a major meaningful difference on average between each other. And now it's time to get to the meat of the video. In this section, I'm going to talk about all of these suggestions for weapons tuning in Destiny 2 endgame PvE that I'm going to make, but first I want to talk about my general balancing thought process when it came to justifying these numbers. So first what I did was I looked at every single weapon family. So for example, bridge GLs, heavy GLs, maybe, fusion rifles. Let's take fusion rifles for example, right? So let's filter by fusion rifles. And then for each and every single weapon family, I looked at the best representative or performer that players tend to identify with within that weapon family. So for fusion rifles, I mean, it's got to be the rapid fire, right? We got Cartesian, scatter signal, the classics. So we're going to sort by boss DPS from highest to lowest, and you see that rapid fires are in fact the best performer. Generally, players gravitate towards the archetype with the highest DPS, regardless of total damage considerations. Next, we're going to analyze this weapon family's identity and determine the fit of the current damage profile, a single data point, the specific archetype, within the rest of the sandbox. So what do I mean by that? Well, fusion rifles, if we think about how their identity works, they are a mid-range weapon. They're not very good for ad clear, so they're kind of explicitly single target outside of, certain perks. And on top of that, they're not expected to do that much damage. They're kind of just like single shot. They have charge time issues. Some of them have really bad charge time issues. That's the identity of a fusion rifle when you think about it. And so based on these factors, how can we compare them to something like a shotgun or a sniper? Well, you could say, well, a shotgun's riskier, it's closer range, but it's hit scan, and you need to hit all the pellets, right? Some shotgun archetypes have a lot of pellets, so maybe fusion rifles should be lower in DPS because they're a safer, easier pick to use. And then you want to get into that conversation of, well, how much safer are there? How much DPS difference should there be? So that's what we're going to talk about in this next section. We analyze every single weapon identity. We look at, for example, rapid fire fusions. We look at rapid fire shotguns. We look at rapid fire snipers, the 3 most popular archetypes of those specific families, and then we compare them. Then for step 3, the final step, we're going to anchor all changes to other archetypes around these representatives in order to make things the most balanced possible. So what do I mean by that? So we're going to isolate every single best archetype from every single weapon family. So like I said, for specials, it'll be rapid fire fusions, rapid fire shotguns, rapid fire snipers. And then what we're going to do is go, okay, maybe rapid fire fusions should do 75% of the DPS of a rapid fire shotgun in order to make the sandbox more balanced. And then maybe rapid fire snipers should do 90% of the DPS of a rapid fire shotgun, just to throw in some random numbers there. And then once we've decided on those numbers and we've tuned the total damage, then we open up the dropdown, we look at the other 4 fusion rifle archetypes, and we say, hey, since we buffed rapid fire fusions by X amount, we should also buff the other fusion rifles accordingly and maybe make some tweaks from there. Right? Does that make sense? So that's kind of how my thought process was. Take the best performer of every single weapon family in the game, and then we're going to compare all those individual data points instead of having to deal with a group of dots. We compare all these dots individually. We turn the dials up and down until we feel that these dots are in the right place in terms of total damage and boss DPS, so the damage profiles. And then from there, we open up those archetype families. We look at every single archetype and we adjust them accordingly from that step onward. And now here comes the fun part. Let's go ahead and check off this post box, and you'll be able to see the changes that I've theorized as being healthy for the Destiny 2 sandbox for power weapons first. So these X's represent what the sandbox currently is, and these lines show you where I've actually moved the damage profiles of every single pretty much power weapon archetype in the game in a possibly beneficial direction. So for a brief summary of the power weapon archetype sandbox, realistically all heavy options except swords because they're melee and LMGs because they're ad clear generally compete in the same boss damage scenarios, meaning they should all occupy distinct regions of this graph, or their damage profiles are going to be competing, they're going to be clashing, right? So they're not going to be distinct. Or they should have their own special reasons to be used. For example, maybe a certain archetype has a range limitation, or a weapon family is actually usable for both splash damage and for boss damage, right? So minor ad clear like rockets with Pack Hunter, and for boss damage as well. So you should either have one of these things going for these weapons, otherwise you're going to have to struggle to make an argument to use one weapon family over the other, and it's going to be a little boring in terms of weapon diversity when it comes to dealing with different bosses or just different endgame scenarios in general. With that in mind, let's talk about heavy GLs first. Now the problem with heavy GLs is that they should have total damage issues, or they will become the default for all damage environments. Because of their lack of a need of pack hunter, and because they're relatively easy to dump and don't have any precision requirement, they kind of are the best burst damage option in the game for people that want legendary power DPS and are maybe solo or just looking for something that's simple and easy to use with something like Envious Assassin. So their DPS should still be the highest base value without optimization in my opinion. That's kind of their niche. They're very easy to dump, but they have total damage issues, or else they're going to be encroaching on the linear space because linears are like the total damage specialists. And if you increase their DPS too much, then they're going to be encroaching on the rocket space, where the goal is to be optimal and have maybe a little bit more total damage in exchange for having one of your teammates on galley, and also in exchange for having some mechanical complexity compared to just holding mouse 1 with a heavy GL. Now, how do we solve the problems that currently exist with heavy GLs in the current weapon sandbox? Well, if you look at pre-patch, you'll notice that the three main archetypes that exist on legendary heavy GLs right now, which are adaptives, rapids, and compressed waves, are incredibly close together in terms of damage profile, which makes it a little bit difficult for a player to distinguish between the three and make a significant decision regarding them. Now, obviously, compressed waves behave very differently from rapid fires and adaptives, but my point kind of still stands when you look at the damage profile differences of something like a machine gun or even like a sword compared to the tiny gaps between these three X's. So one of my goals here is to make better specialization, especially between rapids and adaptives. So how did we pull that off? Well, let's go ahead and look at the experimental tab in my endgame analysis spreadsheet. So the first change I did was rapids already have slightly higher DPS than adaptives, so I just wanted to push them a little bit more in that direction to kind of accompany the other rapid fires, the other high fire rate archetypes on other weapons in Destiny, not just power weapons. So rapid fire heavy GLs, I gave them a 3.4% boost to their damage per shot, and in exchange, I made adaptives have a little bit more total damage. I gave them a 12.9% boost to reserves, leaving them with 35 max ammo on the best archetypes with the highest inventory size. I also noticed that rapid fires and adaptives don't have mag sizes that mirror other weapon families. Usually, rapid fire weapons on other weapon families have bigger mag sizes to compensate for the fact that you have a higher fire rate, meaning the one mag dump time doesn't change too much between different archetypes. On heavy GLs, that's not really the case. Both rapids and adaptives have around 7 to 8 in their mag, depending on what kind of mag setup you have going, as well as whether you're running backup mag or not. In this case, I decided to opt for reducing the max mag size on adaptive heavy GLs by 1 down to 7, just so they feel a little different compared to rapid fires, in addition to having a similar mag dump time. Now, if you remember from my last video, I noted that compressed waveframes kind of struggle with both boss DPS and minor total damage when comparing to stuff like machine guns or pack hunter rockets. And so as a result, I've actually pushed them in one direction rather than trying to strengthen them in both. Waveframes in general are considered an ad clear weapon, so instead of keeping their boss damage high, I opted to reduce it by 10%, instead increasing their reserves by 41.4% effectively up to 41 shots. I've also decided to increase the wave width of compressed waveframes, not by too much, just enough to be slightly noticeable. I don't have the exact numbers on this in particular because I'm not a game dev. I don't have access to visually what wave width increases would look like, but I do think they should be a little bit more distinct in their potency compared to something like a special waveframe. Now, obviously, compressed waveframes have the ability to dump their ammo a lot faster than a special waveframe, but I still think that distinction should exist, and it'll make compressed waveframes a lot more viable in the meta compared to something like pack hunter rockets, especially if you're solo. Now, for every single weapon family, I'm going to discuss what I think the result of my changes will be and justify why I think it's a good idea. So first of all, if we go ahead and go to the bottom of the experimental tab here, you'll notice that the new family data that I've inputted will make it so that the DPS per million total trend line of these drum GLs is going to become negative, from positive around 20k to negative 55k DPS per million total damage gained. On top of that, the options become much more distinct. If we click on this post box here, you'll notice that these squares are much more distinct in terms of their relative location to each other. And of course, they form this kind of nice negative line here, which makes a lot more sense in terms of archetypes and punishing for total damage compared to this weird cluster that we had going on before, where all of the options were pretty similar. And there was like this positive trend where for some reason, as your DPS goes up, your total damage also goes up. Doesn't really make any sense. And on top of that, we still maintain this distinct presence at the top of the group of all of these heavy weapons as being a great DPS option with high burst damage without increasing the total damage so much that we're encroaching on stuff like linears and swords and machine guns. Next up, we have linear fusions. Now, linears have high range, they're like a safe precision option, they should have good total boss damage, and decent DPS since their precision requirement is quite strict. If you miss a crit with these things, you lose a lot of damage. I would also say they're not very effective at close range. Think about bosses like Herald or Crota, where the boss kind of just lunges at you and teleports on you, stomps on you. Not very effective at that range. Now, the main problem with linears is that they have really poor relative damage given that they're a single target, they have a tight precision requirement, their total damage is not great, their DPS is not great, they're just kind of lackluster all around. So what did we decide to do to fix this problem? Well, let's go ahead and look at our experimental tab again. I've actually buffed adaptive burst linears by 20% per shot. I haven't increased their reserves. The increase in total damage is just a natural extension of the damage per shot increase. Precision linears, I've increased their total damage by 15% instead. The reason for this is because, I don't know, contrary to popular belief, adaptive bursts and precision linears actually do very similar shot-to-shot DPS. And so as a result, I wanted to make them a little bit more distinguished from each other. And the reason for that is because precision linears have much higher total damage than adaptives once you account for the fact that they get 4 times a charm. So I wanted to make it so that they're a little bit more specialized. Adaptives now do around 6 to 7% more shot-to-shot DPS than precisions. Obviously, precisions have much higher total damage with access to FTDC though. So what ends up being the actual effect of a change like this? Because I know a lot of people don't think that a flat damage buff is enough to save linears. While I don't necessarily disagree, let's at least look at the effects of what we've done. So the linears are represented by the orange squares here. That's the post-change linear state. And if we take a look at its relative position compared to stuff like the green swords and the blue rockets, you'll notice that the DPS of adaptive linears actually ends up somewhere around manually reloaded aggressive rockets with pack or adaptive pack swords, which is totally fine with me. And if you notice the total damage here, this orange square is a little misleading. Precision linears with 4 times a charm hit around 2.8 million total, which is all the way over here. So the total damage becomes completely distinct from stuff like swords and rockets, which was a big deal back then because this orange X was kind of smacked in the middle of rockets and swords, which was, you know, not a very good place to be for a lower DPS option that has a lot of sustained total damage but requires you to hit crits. So that total damage becoming completely distinct from all the other weapon families, that harkens back to our goal that I mentioned earlier. We want these 3 mainstream DPS families to remain very distinct from each other. We have heavy GLs, we have rockets, and we have linears, which are now going to occupy this far right region of the graph. I would say precisions are a little bit more balanced around their total damage now. They've moved down a bit relatively compared to just being on the same flat line as adaptives, so I think that's totally fair as well. Machine guns are up next. Now, machine guns are characterized by their relatively poor boss DPS, but very good minor total damage due to their add clear specialization. Now, if you'll notice here, if we look at the pre-patch curve, we notice some problems. The rapid-fire LMG is really far to the left, meaning it's quite underperformant in total damage, and like we've said in the past, I don't think its increase in minor DPS really makes up for this effectively. So that's problem number 1. Number 2 is that adaptives and aggressives are a little too close to each other mathematically, and so we could separate them a little bit and evenly space them out across this line. Instead of changing their y-axis values or their damage values too much, we can just shift adaptives over to the right and aggressives over to the left. So how did I actually address this problem? Let's go ahead and look at the endgame analysis sheet. Let's check the experimental tab again for some answers. So rapid fire LMGs, I do think they're underperforming a little bit, so they gave them a 4% damage increase in addition to a 1.1% reserve increase to increase their total ammo to around 750. Now, high impacts, I didn't touch their damage per shot, but I did increase their total damage by 0.6% to increase their ammo count to a nice round 500. Aggressive LMGs, again, no damage per shot change, but a 1.7% increase to ammo, just so they're a nice flat 600. And finally, adaptive LMGs, which were underperforming a little bit in terms of total damage, I made them a little bit more distinct by increasing their total damage by 7%, which increases their max ammo count to 535. So what is the result of all of these changes? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at our post patch. You'll see that all 4 red squares are pretty much evenly spaced here. In fact, I did this intentionally. I calculated so that there is an 8 to 9% DPS difference between every archetype now, and there's a 9 to 10% total difference between all archetypes as well. And there's almost no outliers in the trend line, which means theoretically, mathematically, all 4 options in terms of machine guns should be equally viable in players' eyes right now, at least outside of subjective preferences, for example, recoil or feeling of a weapon. But outside of those preferences, all 4 machine gun archetypes should be equally viable, equally appealing now, at least mathematically speaking. There should be an adequate compromise in your total damage if you choose to increase your DPS with machine gun archetype selection, and vice versa. On top of that, the reason why these 4 red squares are not exactly on the line is because I also wanted to take the opportunity to clean up the ammo values and make them nice and round. You got 600, 500, 750, and 535. That's as close as I could get to round numbers without making these options deviate too much from the trend line. Now, rockets have excellent boss DPS if you optimize their rotation, otherwise they're just decent. They have decent boss total damage, excellent minor total damage if Pack Hunter is involved. And rockets are also the closest to another heavy weapon family, being heavy GLs, in terms of their damage profile. So the distinction between the two does actually matter. And in my opinion, rockets, their identity should be based on the willingness to optimize and use some sort of damage rotation or reload assist, and they also have better minor ad clear in fire teams. However, with rockets, you do need to have one of your teammates use Pack Hunter in order for them to outperform heavy GLs, and of course they are a lot more mechanically difficult to use compared to something like a heavy GL where simplicity is the goal. And so I think this is enough to distinguish the two, to separate the two, to make them individually unique. And so that's kind of the idea I had going forward when it comes to my balancing of these 2 weapon families. Now, what are the problems that we see when we examine the rocket weapon family? Well, as you can see here, aggressives and adaptives are rather similar. In fact, they are basically the exact same archetype, except for aggressives have 1 more shot, and they have a slightly higher fire rate, but that doesn't really affect manual reload DPS. So in my opinion, to make them a little different, I gave aggressive rockets a 2.5% increase to their damage per shot, which can be seen right over here, but I didn't increase their reserves, leaving them at 11 ammo. Then I left adaptives as the exact same, so they have a slight deficit in terms of damage per shot versus aggressives, but I increased their reserves by 20% so that they actually have 12 ammo now compared to the aggressives 11. Now, precisions and high impacts, in my opinion, and I think in the community's opinion, they disproportionately underperform compared to where aggressives and adaptives were before. And even despite Bungie slightly buffing precision rockets and improving the reserves of precision and high impact rockets significantly, people really didn't turn to these rockets unless they were doing something like a GM with Pack Hunter. And in terms of damage rotations, they were largely seen as being rather irrelevant compared to something like Cold Comfort or Apex Predator, which have more favorable frames. So what I decided to do was I adjusted rockets so that the difference between every archetype is simply 2.5%. So from aggressive to adaptive, 2.5. From adaptive to high impact, 2.5. Finally, from high impact to precision, 2.5. And so the way that I did this is I buffed high impact rockets by 4.1% per shot. I buffed precision rockets by 7% per shot, and finally I also increased precision reserves by 1, which would lead them up to 14 ammo for an actual reserve increase of 7.7%, taking into account the damage per shot change. So in summary, the gap between all these archetypes has become identical. If we go to Tableau here and we check the post screen, you'll see that this teal line is perfectly straight now. All 4 rocket archetypes are evenly spaced out. Just like how we talked about machine guns are evenly spaced out, look at these rockets, they're basically on the same line, perfectly spaced out, mathematically equally viable. Aggressive rockets have become like this damage specialist with worse stat lines and worse reserves, but higher DPS, and there are no longer any outliers here to speak of. Now, last but certainly not least, we have swords. Now, swords are the most recently significantly transformed power weapon family in Destiny, and their identity goes something like this. They're melee range with a high survivability risk. Most bosses, if you go right up next to them, they're going to stomp, they're going to spew fire on you, whatever. And a lot of bosses, if you're under light, that's going to mean you're going to die, right? So a bit of a high risk. They should not have the highest base DPS, in my opinion, of all the power weapon families, because otherwise other strategies will be completely invalidated on melee range bosses, given how easy it is to use swords provided you don't die. So as a result, I think swords have kind of carved out their own niche, even in their current, pre-patch sandbox state. I think they're all right. They're kind of in their own region of the graph. It makes sense to use them. On some bosses, they're kind of like the defining meta. On other bosses where you could get in melee range like War Priest, it still makes sense to use other weapons. So swords are situational, but in the situations where they do apply and you can use them, they are definitely a strong contenders. They're also decent in roam gameplay now with some of the ammo changes and the fact that they get Pack Hunter. Now, some of the comments I'd like to make about the archetypes before we talk about our changes. So first of all, right now, aggressive swords don't get Pack Hunter. So this obviously sucks a lot for people that like to use aggressive swords, but Bungie has said that this is a known issue and they plan on fixing it. Now, most sword archetypes get about a 12% damage increase overall because of Pack Hunter. Aggressive swords, I just guesstimated, gave them 12%. Obviously, Pack Hunter is an additive buff, so on different sword archetypes, it gives a different amount of damage, but I just gave, aggressive swords 12%. It might end up being less than that, but it's an approximation, right? So we're going to pretend that aggressive swords do get Pack Hunter, and I gave them that buff as part of my little patch, okay? Because that kind of explains why they're underperforming in terms of DPS compared to other archetypes. Now, Vortex frames do benefit from Pack Hunter, and yet they are a significant underperformer when it comes to total damage and boss DPS, right? So I wanted to transform Vortex swords into, not only are they like, potentially usable for ad clear, even though they have horrible ammo efficiency issues, I wanted to increase their damage by 20%, and I think that will bring them up more into healthy territory. So as you can see here, 20% increase to Vortex frame swords. Wave swords, in my opinion, overperform a little too much. Now, granted, we did talk about how this value is a little unrealistic because of the combo cycle time value that I used for wave swords is basically impossible to hit on, realistic bosses, even if you have very high charge rate. So we talked about this. I'm going to move wave frame swords down by 5%, so they do 95% of their previous damage. That way, they still are the kind of best damage sword in the game, the best damage sword profile in the game, but they're a little situational in terms of their tracking and their combo speed, and of course they do have scaling issues as well, but I'm going to assume that Bungie's going to try to fix that, and that's going to be in my conclusion as well. Finally, lightweights and aggressives, in my opinion, are not really distinct enough. Once you bring aggressives up and you give them that Pack Hunter buff simulated, they actually do a higher DPS and a higher amount of total damage than lightweight swords, which is just kind of unfair in my opinion. So I did some things to separate them a little bit. I think lightweight swords should be the defining total damage archetype on swords, so that's what I decided to do. If we go over to my spreadsheet right now, you'll see aggressive swords, I have decreased their reserves by 4%-ish, so they do 95.6% of what they used to do at 65 ammo total. And then lightweight swords, I've actually increased their total damage by around 5.6%, and that leaves them with 95 max ammo instead of what they used to have, which I believe was 90. So what are the results here? Well, the results are, if we go to the post section, swords mostly follow this green trend line now, right? They're mostly flat, they're mostly follow the trend. Now, the only real outliers here are going to be adaptives and waves. And the reason for that is adaptives, I've had to balance them as being a little bit under the line because with Bequest, they're actually over the line. So this keeps them a little bit in balance. If you have a really, really high impact aggressive sword, it's going to be a little bit above the rest. But if you have a normal adaptive sword, it's going to be below the rest, right? So that's kind of the compromise I had to pick. If adaptives, were buffed to be in line with everything else, Bequest would be a little too strong. And so I've kind of reined them in a little bit and they're just like a little bit below the line in terms of where you would expect them to be. Now, everything else is looking pretty good. Vortex swords are, looking pretty decent. They have higher base DPS than something like a caster or most adaptives. And that's great because they have huge ammo costs. So I'm a fan of that. I'm totally fine with that. Aggressives have competitive DPS, while lightweights have higher total damage. Vortexes don't completely overshadow adaptives, casters, and waves. And of course, waves are still like a really strong archetype, but you're not always going to just choose them just straight up 100% of the time now. And, this is even accounting for the fact that, they have fireteam scaling issues. Even in solo instances, you're not always going to pick the wave sword over everything else. It's a lot more balanced here. And again, we talked about combo speed. This is more likely to be like right above the line instead. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about power weapons. If you're interested in the actual detailed patch breakdown, I have this experimental tab. I'm going to put it in the description. You know what? I'll probably even include my script/outline for this video because it kind of has like the summary of my, thinking, my thought process behind all of these changes that you can view at a glance while I'm talking. Kind of like a video outline or like a set of patch notes, I suppose, that might be helpful to some of you. Now, the overall result of what I did to power weapons is they have much more distinct groups, right? If we look at our post change, we have swords in this nice cluster, heavy GLs in this nice cluster. You have, linears, which are kind of like over here, right? You have rockets, which are over here, and you have machine guns over here, and they're all nice and tightly packed. They all follow this clear trend. If we go to the pre-change, you'll see here, there's definitely a little bit more confusion in terms of this lower group being pretty close together. Heavy GLs have this weird positive slope for some reason. There's a lot of outliers on every single group. So I think the post change is pretty solid, and we can mathematically justify this as well. Every weapon family trendline is objectively much cleaner, much more correlated. As you can see here, the new R² values, the correlation coefficient values, are a lot higher than their old values. So I think we did a fairly good job of that. And of course, the entire sandbox in general has a better fit from top left to bottom right. All of these weapon families basically have negative DPS per million values. Obviously linears, this would be over here, and we can ignore precision heavy GLs, so this would be a negative slope as well. So pretty good stuff. Let's move on to special weapons. Now, special weapons, in my opinion, are generally a little better defined and more distinct than heavy weapons, but there's still a lot to talk about when it comes to special weapons. Now, let's talk about breach grenade launchers first. Now, breach GLs, their identity is ammo efficient splash ad clear, so I'm looking at wave frames, area denial frames, or it's like low blast radius, high single instance damage. Now, one of the problems with breach GLs is that second part, high single instance damage. I mean, if you take a look at the boss DPS numbers here, these blue X's, which are breach GLs, they're a lot lower than like everything else that's relevant for boss damage. So not looking too hot. But let's talk about the actual concrete issues that I have with breach GLs. I have two of them. So first things first, I do think wave frames are generally a little weak versus rocket sidearms right now. I think most people would agree with me. Generally, people are taking stuff like Aberrant Action and Indebted Kindness over Forbearance in most activities now, especially in higher scaled endgame content. I think wave frames obviously have trouble one-shotting enemies in underpowered content, but if you look at the mathematical difference between wave frames and rocket sidearms, I believe wave frames need to hit around 2.3 enemies on average to even out in their minor DPS against rocket sidearms, and that's ignoring the fact that rocket sidearms can also hit multiple enemies at the same time, which makes this scaling comparison even worse for breach GLs. So how do we fix this problem? Well, wave frames, I decided to buff their damage per shot by around 20%, which brings them closer to a 2 ad hit on average in order to match rocket sidearms. I also think that we should increase their blast radius scaling effect. So what do I mean by this? Well, I think the length of wave frames is mostly fine right now, but when Bungie announced that they were going to tie wave frame width to the blast radius stat, a lot of people were like, okay, let's farm adept forbearances so we can get max blast radius wave frames, so we can get nice fat waves. And then the actual change came out and we realized it's like 1/4 of a meter for every 10 blast radius, which is essentially unnoticeable given that most wave frames exist around like 40-50 blast radius, and even if you spec in for max blast radius and you go adept blast radius on a adept forbearance, you get like 85 blast radius, and so it didn't really make that much of a difference. Not only will it make wave frames a little bit easier to use in terms of their contention against rocket sidearms, but I also think it'll just increase the diversity in roles players are willing to pursue when it comes to wave frame BGLs in particular. So 20% damage increase, blast radius scaling effect. The second major problem I have with breach GLs is probably the bigger problem of the two, and that's that single target breach GL. So I'm talking double fire, lightweight, micromissile. They lack diversity and specialization. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at their data points here. We have lightweight breach GLs, double fire breach GLs, and micromissile breach GLs. Now immediately you'll notice a problem. First of all three of these are in a straight line, and the slope of the trend line is positive. Now, in the past, when we've had outliers in specific archetype families, we've said, oh, like compressed waveframes are an outlier because they're designed for ad clear, so they should perform in such and such a way. They're a unique frame. These three archetypes are essentially identical in their role. They're low blast radius, they're not really designed for ad clear, and they shoot out a projectile that's, affected by gravity, or it has like travel time. They basically do the same things, and yet they have the same total shot count, except double fires and micromissiles completely dominate lightweights. There's no reason to ever use a lightweight. Sure, you can argue, movement bonus. Sure, you can argue handling good base stats, but there are other archetype families in this game where a lightweight frame is the best damage profile. So this makes no sense, especially to have a gap this large. This is a massive gap in total damage and DPS, so this is a big problem. On top of that, even between double fires and micromissiles, there's no reason to ever use something that's not a micromissile. The only reason why Wildstyle and Wilderflight are even contenders in the energy slot is because we don't have an energy mountaintop, right? If micromissile existed in the energy slot, there would be no reason to use a Wildstyle or a Wilderflight. Double fires are objectively harder to use. They have two separate projectiles that split over long distances. They're affected by gravity, and micromissiles have higher utility because you can use them for movement and knockback as well. So there's really zero reason to use anything that's a double fire or a lightweight if the sandbox options were completely open and universal. So that's the big problem. Now, how do we diversify and specialize these three archetypes in a way that mirrors some of the other healthier weapon families that we've been looking at? So let's go ahead and look at this spreadsheet tab once more. What have I done to breach GLs? Well, number one, double fires, I've increased their damage per shot by 20%. In exchange, I've also decreased their reserves by 20% as well, which results in an overall total damage decrease of 4% and also gives double fires a max of 20 shots instead of the 25, which was the standard for breach GLs in the past. Now, lightweight's easily the worst performing member of the group. I gave them a 35.2% damage increase per shot, as well as an additional 12% multiplicative reserve increase, which increases their total shot count to 28. Now, you might think this is a pretty large number, but then you'd be underestimating just how bad lightweights were compared to double fires and micro missiles. And I'll talk about why these numbers make sense when I talk about the overall result of my BGL changes. Finally, micro missiles, I do think breach GLs in general are in need of a family-sized buff. As you can see here, this blue line and these blue X's are relatively underperforming in overall boss DPS compared to literally any relevant boss DPS archetype. And so as a result, I've also given micro missiles a 10% damage per shot buff while decreasing their reserves by 8% down to 23 shots from 25. This results in an overall 1.2% total damage buff, but that's not really significant. I've also noted down here that I think their blast radius should be increased in order to further specialize them. Lightweights and double fires, in my opinion, lightweights should fall into this niche where you have a lot of total shots. They're very ammo efficient. You can use them for blinding for that purpose in particular because you get 28 total ammo. That's a lot of ammo. Double fires, on the other hand, they're the damage specialists, so they have less ammo, and micro missiles fill this happy medium in between where you can kind of use them for ad clear, they're usable for movement, and you can use them for burst damage if that's your kind of thing as well. So I think these changes will diversify and specialize these three archetypes very effectively, and in terms of mathematical results, we can justify our changes in this way as well. Now, as a result of these changes, the DPS and total damage gap of these archetypes has been reduced to 6 to 10%, which is much healthier than the former 35% difference between double fires and lightweights, which was absolutely insane. Waves reach around a 1.9 times difference versus rocket sidearms, which means you only have to hit 1.9 adds on average to meet a single target rocket sidearm DPS value. And finally, if we want to look at trend lines here, ignoring area denials and waveframes, if you take a look at these three single target breach GLs and we account for them in our calculations here, the DPS per million value goes from positive 27,000 down to negative 26,000, which is a much healthier value. And let's go ahead and look at that post graph as well. You'll be able to see here, if we go to our dark blue line, you'll see that's very clearly a negative trend here compared to before where it was positive and made absolutely no sense to use anything on the left side of the graph. Now these three are relatively balanced, right? Relatively balanced. Double fires, high DPS, low total, micro missile in the middle, and of course the highest total belonging to lightweight with the lowest DPS instead. Next up, we have fusion rifles. Now, fusion rifles are characterized by their decent total damage, their mid-range safe options that prioritize ease of use over optimal damage. So as a result, compared to something like a shotgun, which is riskier, or a sniper, which has a precision requirement, fusions are gonna need to take a hit. Now, how much of a hit do they need to take? Well, currently, rapid fire fusions, which we've said before, do 63% of the DPS of a rapid fire shotgun. So I decided, I think that's a little bit too much, right? I think fusions are punished a little too much. They feel very weak, in my opinion, compared to shotguns and snipers, if we're comparing them just, face to face. And in my opinion, I've scaled rapid fire fusions up to 75% instead of 63% of a rapid fire shotgun's DPS. So that's the first problem, right? That's what we're going to scale all the other fusion rifles off of. I've also needed to handle quite a few outliers. As you can see here, precision fusions are severely underperforming, and aggressive fusions, adaptive fusions, and even high impact fusions, they exist kind of in this straight line where they all do almost the exact same DPS despite having wildly different total damage values. So I want to scale this back as well. Obviously, high impacts, the reason why they do so much total damage while also having similar DPS values is because people complain about the charge time and people were like, high impact fusions suck. So Bungie increased their DPS and therefore also their total damage because they didn't cut the reserves of high impact fusions. So in my opinion, I'm going to readjust some of these things and we're going to talk about that while looking at the actual spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and look at fusion rifles. What did I change? Rapid fire fusions in particular got an 18.7% damage per shot buff in order to match that 75% target that I talked about earlier. Now, in terms of the other stuff, adaptive fusions, since they're underperforming compared to rapids, which were a positive outlier before, I gave them a 24.3% buff. Aggressive fusions got a 26.5% buff. The reason for that is because aggressives have a horizontal recoil pattern, and even though we've discussed in the past video that that's not really a big deal, I think this will help break the negative stigma people will have towards aggressives. I always find it interesting to have archetypes of weapons that are a little different, maybe a little quirky, a little hard to get used to compared to other weapon types that are more traditional and easy to use, and giving people a little bit of a damage buff, a little bit of a reward for choosing to use a weapon archetype like so. And I hope this will also incentivize Bungie to maybe make a new aggressive fusion that's, you know, not Coriolis Force and horrible. So maybe if we get one with some decent perks, aggressive fusions, maybe people will consider using them, because I honestly think the horizontal recoil pattern is not that much of a big deal, and the single shot burst coming out the bolts basically all at once is pretty nice as well. So you know, don't hit on the aggressive fusions too much, folks. All right. Next up, we have precision fusions. As you saw in the graph, precision fusions are hugely underperforming. They're a big negative outlier, so I gave them a 34.1% damage buff, in addition to a 3.6% reserve buff, which will buff their total shot count to 29. Finally, I think high impact fusions are kind of in a confusing area right now. They do okay DPS, similar to adaptives and aggressives. They have high total damage, but nobody wants to use them because of their charge rate. Now, here's what I'm going to do to kind of solidify the role of high impact fusions. Yeah, I'm going to give them a buff. It's going to be a 13.2% buff though, compared to adaptives and aggressives. So they're losing ground in terms of DPS. However, I increased their total damage by 7.1%, which is the largest reserve increase of any fusion rifle archetype here. This will solidify their role as being a lower DPS but a much higher total damage fusion rifle archetype, which might be more appealing to players who want to use fusion rifles in longer span endgame content rather than something like a boss DPS phase. Now, don't get me wrong, you can still use a high impact fusion rifle, especially given all the powerful rolls we've received on specific weapons like Eremite, Loaded Question, Glacioclasm. You can certainly use a high impact fusion rifle still, but it's just not going to be optimal compared to something like a rapid, even more so than it is right now. But the total damage will be fairly strong for a special weapon. 1.6 is fairly high total boss damage for a special weapon that is as easy to use as a fusion rifle, much higher than you're going to see on something like a sniper or a shotgun. So that's going to leave high impact fusion rifles with 30 shots total. Now, finally, I also think this is a small thing, right? Because this is not something I typically tweak in terms of damage profile, but I think the minor scalar of fusion rifles should be increased. Right now, it's at 1.07, which is insanely low. I think that is the lowest minor scalar I've seen on any legendary weapon archetype. And so there's a lot of fusion rifles out there that kind of want to be used for ad clear. You have like Discord Reservoir Burst fusion rifles. That's a pretty good roll, right? Or like even just Discord with anything, or just Reservoir Burst with anything. There are fusion rifle perks where Bungie's game devs are clearly like, yo, we want you to use this to splash ad clear some ads, right? So why not help fusion rifles by giving their minor scalar a bit of a buff? 7% is a ridiculously low number for an archetype that is generally not very powerful for ad clear. It makes no sense for a fusion rifle to have a 7% increase compared to bosses for minors. And then if you look at snipers, their scalar is 2.08. That is a 108% increase to damage to minors, right? So you can't really make the argument that like fusions, oh, they're not an ad clear weapon. Are snipers an ad clear weapon? No, they're not, right? So fusion rifles, give them a little bit higher of a minor scalar. I'm not asking you to give them like the 2 times that, you know, snipers have. Maybe, I don't know, like 1.3, 1.4. It just doesn't make sense that the number is this low. It seems just like ridiculously low for an archetype that's, you know, not super ammo efficient. Giving them a 50% increase to their minor damage is not going to make them outshine like a wave GL or a rocket sidearm or anything. So, you know, what's the harm is what I'm saying. What's the harm, right? So in terms of the actual changes, the effects of all the changes that I'm mentioning here for fusion rifles, here's my summary. Fusions, after these changes, if we go to the post graph here, they're almost all in line here. They're almost all in line with each other. The R² value, in fact, so the correlation coefficient, if you go ahead and look at fusion rifles here, has been brought from almost 0 to almost 0.91, right? Which is really, really good, right? And in my opinion, fusions with this overall buff, where we scaled rapid fire fusions up to 75% of shotguns rather than 63, I think that will feel a lot less neglected compared to snipers and shotguns, with high impacts leaning more into their total damage roll. As you can see, they're all the way on the right here. Compared to every other special weapon on this graph, you know, high impact fusion rifles are a clear outlier on the right side of the graph. The only thing that comes close from another weapon family is something like area denial GLs, which I think is totally fine, right? They take way longer to dump their ammo. think high impacts being kind of isolated on the right side is pretty solid. Precision fusion rifles are no longer going to be completely awful, right? They're still kind of mostly in line with the other fusions. They're not significantly below the trend line. And I think aggressives, the reason why they're above everything else is, again, I wanted to reward players that use aggressive fusion rifles by giving them a little bit more total damage and a little bit more DPS bang for their buck, to account for the fact that aggressives feel a little different, feel a little awkward perhaps to play. So yeah, I hope these changes make it so people definitely give fusion rifles a second glance if you're more of an optimal player. And if you're already a fusion rifle enjoyer in PvE and you roll up with a scatter signal to a lot of different content, you're going to appreciate this change as well. I don't think this is going to make anything unhealthy. I don't think this is going to make fusion rifles the default over certain exotic special weapons or anything like that. This is just going to make them feel better, healthier in the sandbox. They definitely don't encroach into this sniper and shotgun territory. As you can see here, they're clearly in their own territory. So I think this is a healthy change without over-tuning fusion rifles too much. Okay, so we've talked about fusions. Let's talk about glaives next. Now, glaives are a little interesting. Now, first of all, they do have this positive trendline slope that we mentioned earlier, but I think that's to compensate for aggressives, not feeling too good. And of course, the offensive potential of glaives is not particularly important. The identity of glaives, in fact, is a strictly defensive option that should be punished damage-wise accordingly versus something like a shotgun or like a sniper or something that's designed for killing potency. Now, in terms of the problems that I have with glaives, I think glaives are actually mostly balanced. However, I still think aggressives feel generally pretty awful stat-wise and don't really have much to compensate for it, so I've gone ahead and changed them a small amount. Aggressives, I've given them a 5% damage buff. I've also given them a 3.3% reserve increase to 31 shots total, for a total of 8.5% increase to their overall total damage. Now, rapid fire glaives, in my opinion, they're a little lacking in total damage versus other glaives, so I gave them a 9.1% increase to their reserves for 36 total shots. I think it was a little awkward to have some of these ammo counts be essentially identical like adaptives and rapid fires, so I wanted to segment these a little further, and mathematically that becomes a little bit justifiable when I talk about the overall summary of what I've done to glaives. Now, overall, in summary, with these changes, I think glaives are mostly balanced already. It's mostly a sandbox / activity / design related issue that's causing problems for them right now. But these changes, in my opinion, they bring glaives into more of a straight line when it comes to damage profile trade-offs. So as you can see here, adaptives and aggressives are really close, with rapids, trailing really far behind in total damage. If we look at our post patch here, you'll see that there's much more even spacing between these three glaive archetypes. On top of that, aggressives have a small buff to compensate for their awful stats. Adaptives have a relative nerf, given that they have the best general stat package, especially referencing stuff like shield duration. Now, in terms of this glaive red trendline actually being positive, this is the only archetype family in the game where I'm actually kind of okay with that. And that's because the quality assessment, the subjective assessment that players have of glaives, kind of doesn't really have anything to do with their damage profile, especially to bosses, right? And so I think quality of life is a big factor for players. And if we want to increase quality of life for something like an aggressive glaive, there really wasn't much of a reason to use an aggressive glaive other than for like a specific role compared to an adaptive before. Now you might give it a second chance because it does a little bit more damage, even though the total shot count is a bit lower and the stats are not so great. Maybe there is a reason to use an aggressive glaive. Maybe it one-shots a specific ad type that you kind of favor in a specific activity. So it just gives people a reason to use an aggressive glaive, which is like the whole point of this entire project. Give everyone a reason to consider every single archetype from a mathematical standpoint, and in this case, for glaives, from a subjective quality of life standpoint. So that's pretty much all I have to say about glaives. Let's move on to shotguns next. Now, shotguns are some of the most powerful special weapons in the sandbox. They're melee range, in your face, risky, so they should have high DPS and burst damage, but mediocre total damage similar to heavy GLs. Now, I have two problems with the shotgun sandbox right now. Number one, everything looks like an outlier if you decide to anchor your shotgun damage profiles around rapid fire shotguns. Now, you could argue, well, rapid fire shotguns, aren't they the outlier? They look like they're above everything else. Why not just remove this rapid fire shotgun advantage and pull them down to everything else? Well, there's a couple problems with that, but the big thing I want to talk about here is one of my sandbox design philosophies, and that is, if something feels subjectively balanced to a lot of endgame players in current content, then it makes sense to balance around that option. I talked about this when I was changing primary hand cannon values, and I realized that I don't really need to change them because most of them are in line with each other. They're fairly balanced in terms of being an archetype family, and outside of the archetype family, when you compare them to other primary options, most people agreed with me that they feel pretty fine right now. Hand cannons are in a good spot. And so we try to balance around that grouping and put stuff above the hand cannons and below the hand cannons. And I'm going to do the same thing with rapid fire shotguns. They don't feel particularly overpowered right now. Not a lot of people are using them for crazy boss DPS strats or anything. They're fine in my opinion. And of course, this is shot-to-shot DPS. So in reality, you have to take into account that rapid fire shotguns are, number one, punish the most by reloading, because reloads take a lot longer than the time between 2 shots on a rapid fire compared to something like an aggressive. Even if you use something like rate of fire, rapid fires are going to be punished more in overall sustained DPS compared to other archetypes here. And number 2, they have the shortest mag dump time of every single archetype by far. So shot-to-shot DPS is maybe not necessarily the most realistic value to measure rapid fire shotguns by compared to other stuff here. So it's okay that they are above the other archetypes. So how do we balance the other archetypes so they feel as good as the rapid fire shotgun? That's a good question. Let's go ahead and look at my first problem. Outlier handling. I shifted aggressives up by 8.5% damage per shot. Lightweight shotguns, I gave them 10.7% damage per shot, as well as a 9.1% reserve increase, which brings their total shot count up to 24. Precision shotguns, so the pellet versions, I gave them a 14.3% damage buff because they were underperforming. And finally, rapid fire shotguns, I gave them a slight reserve increase just so mathematically everything is in line. You'll see that in a second. 3.2% increase, so they get up to 32 total shots in their reserves now. Now you'll notice I've left out one archetype of shotgun because that's my second problem. In my opinion, right now, slugs don't really feel like they're special or they're worth using, given that you have to hit a crit with them. For a weapon that requires a precision hit in order to work at maximum efficacy, in my opinion, slugs should get a 20% damage buff rather than the 14.3 that precisions have received, and a 4% reserve buff as well to differentiate them slightly more from precision shotguns, their pellet counterpart, so that they get 26 total ammo instead of 25. So what does this actually do to the shotgun sandbox? Well, let's go ahead and look at our post-patch graph here. As you can see, shotguns, which are the teal color here, mostly exist in a straight line, with slugs being a clear outlier as a result of the changes that I applied to them. However, they follow a much smoother trend. As you can see here, previously, shotguns kind of all existed in this line, with rapid fires being a sore thumb sticking out. Now they're mostly in the same cluster, with slugs being a sore thumb sticking out, but for a good reason. Now, the only outliers that exist due to their nature. Rapids have much higher RPM and lower time to dump on mags, and of course, slugs need crits. In terms of mathematical justification, if we scroll down here, shotguns, we have an R-squared value increase from 0.46 all the way up to 0.76, meaning this weapon family is a lot more consistent in terms of DPS and total damage increases being proportional for every single archetype change. Now let's take a brief intermission to talk about rocket sidearms and traces. Now obviously these are not boss DPS weapons, so we're going to talk about them in the minor DPS / primary context instead. Now, rocket sidearms, they have a better damage profile than all legendary primaries. They're like the go-to single target ad clearer right now. And so that might make some of you want to hit their damage. However, I would advise against that. Rocket sidearms, in my opinion, are adequately compromised because of the fact that they're inherently single target, they have projectile travel time, they're sidearms, etc., etc. So they're compromised a little bit in that regard. They're not as splashy as something like a wave frame or an area denial frame. So I would not want to cut into the really good feeling, frankly, of using a rocket sidearm. They feel like a strong weapon. They're a special weapon. They should be better than primaries, right? However, the problem is special weapons have ammo limitations. That's like the whole reason why they are worse than primaries in some respects. And so rocket sidearms don't really feel like a special weapon. They don't feel that limitation too much because of how much ammo they can hold. So in my opinion, I'm going to tentatively nerf rocket sidearms by around 10% of their total damage. They're going to have 89.5% reserves now, so down to 68 shots at max reserves. I'm going to try that out. And, you know, if that doesn't feel balanced either, we can reduce it even further. But I don't want to cut into them too much, right? They're still designed to be a single target ad clear option. So if you cut too much, it's going to feel really horrible. So I think just a little bit of a nudge in the right direction is a good way to first try out kind of trying to balance rocket sidearms a little bit more. But in terms of the feel of the weapon, unmatched, great, excellent, good special weapon. I really wish in general the Destiny balancing philosophy was more like, hey, here's this really strong thing that's not like obviously broken like one-shots bosses or whatever, but here's this really strong thing. How can we make other weak options in the sandbox feel as good as this, right? Why can't we have everything feel great to use? You know what I'm saying? So that's kind of the goal of this patch, having everything brought up to parity rather than having a bunch of really OP options from time to time and hammering them down one by one like gophers. Now, that's enough for rocket sidearms. Let's talk about trace rifles next. Now, identity-wise, trace rifles are like a mid-range stable spray weapon. They occupy the same range tier as like an auto rifle or a pulse rifle, and in my opinion, they should be high ammo count to facilitate that identity, and they should also have decent minor DPS as well. Now, the problem with trace rifles is that they're a special ammo weapon that shares the same range tier as like a pulse rifle, and yet they have worse minor DPS and range than heavy burst pulses. Now, I am hitting heavy burst pulses quite hard in the primary section of this video, so that's maybe not the most valid reference point, but I do think they should feel a lot stronger. So I've increased their damage per shot by 30%, which in turn also increases their total damage by 30%. And as a result, traces now do around 80% of rocket sidearm DPS with a much more difficult precision requirement, much worse range, and of course their total damage is a little more passable as well, nowhere near something like a rocket sidearm as you can see here because of minor scalars, but certainly more effective than primaries, which they should be given that they're special weapons that have ammo limitations. Now, if you want to see what these changes look like in the context of other minor DPS options, let's go ahead and visualize them here. As you can see, I've brought in some of these special weapons here. Trace rifles have moved from right around here to right around here. They're clearly distinct from the rest of the primaries, which I think a special weapon should be. You can see HGL, some of these have moved up as well. And as you can see, rocket sidearms just are head and shoulders above everything else. I know numbers are kind of difficult to talk about and visualize at the same time, so I think this is a nice little visual aid that can help you see. Rocket sidearms are just head and shoulders above every other legendary primary, which is fine. And trace rifles are like between the average primary and rocket sidearms, which I think is also totally fine and balanced. Now, finally, we have snipers. Now, snipers, they have high range, so you can sit back and use them wherever you want. However, they do have a strict precision requirement. They're very punishing if you miss crits. They have decent total damage, and they're a little awkward for ad clear. So the problem with sniper rifles that I have right now is two problems. Number one, they're still kind of an awkward choice in most endgame content. In something like a GM or a Master Raid, are you going to bring a rapid fire sniper with you? Even this season, when you have like Sniper's Meditation, you have Anti-Barrier Sniper, are you going to bring a rapid fire sniper with you? It's like, maybe. Aggressive sniper, like, maybe. I don't know. They just feel very awkward in terms of the generally understood role that special weapons have right now. I mean, rocket sidearms. If you have Anti-Barrier Sidearm, no doubt people are taking rocket sidearms left, right, center into endgame content. Snipers, they just don't seem to fill that same level of viability. And I'm not saying this is like a damage problem necessarily, although I have adequately, given them a little bit of compensation for that as well. But snipers are just kind of awkward. They're in this awkward place right now. I'm not really sure what you can do to fix them in terms of the overall sandbox feel, but let's see what we can do about that. So that's the first problem. Number two is that obviously adaptives are proportionally weaker, right? Rapid fires are, they're great, they're strong, whatever. Adaptives are just horrible, right? They have lower DPS than rapid fires, and they also have lower total damage. So it's like, what are we doing here? What are we doing here, right? So how do we fix this? Let's go ahead and go back to our spreadsheet. Let's look at the sniper rifles, which are at the bottom of the tab here, and let's talk about it. So number one, aggressive snipers, I've given them a 5% damage increase. I've also increased their reserves by 7.7% up to 28 shots. Rapid fire snipers, I've also given them a 5% damage increase, and I haven't touched their total reserve, so they still remain at 40 total shots. And finally, adaptive snipers, I've increased their damage by 9.2%, and I've also given them a 3.3% reserve increase up to 31 shots. So what is the result here? All three sniper archetypes should be in a straight line, and they should be equally mathematically viable. In fact, the R-squared value of snipers has gone from 0.32 or 0.33 up to basically 1. So they're basically perfectly equally mathematically viable. So gave them a small buff to boost viability a little bit. Let's go ahead and look at the graph. Let's look at the post changes here. So you can see snipers basically perfectly straight yellow line. So that's pretty much it for specials. Overall, I think we can say specials look much cleaner in terms of their trend lines. Every single color here just looks a lot smoother and cleaner compared to their pre-patch state. And I would say there's a distinct duality also that's formed between these two groups here. We have the damage intensive, like single target weapons, fusion, sniper, shotguns. And also we have the ad clear focus or utility focus weapons. We have glaives, we have traces, we have rocket sidearms, we have, breach GLs. So I'm glad that there's this kind of strict duality forming here. And it's not as kind of intermingled in the middle here as it was before. We always like distinctness forming between the archetype families of the weapons in this game. And so I think this is a pretty good indicator that we are meeting our goals that we set for ourselves earlier, trying to make every archetype in its own region of the graph so that they are distinct and that players have a reason to use all of them, whether we're talking range versus melee risk, whether we're talking total damage versus boss DPS. Now, before we get started with primaries, there's a misconception I want to clear up that I myself had before I started working on this spreadsheet. Almost without exception, all primary weapon families share similar range values between archetypes, meaning there's no reason for different members of the same primary type to have a significantly different DPS value. Even with auto rifles, which have the biggest range gap, reaching almost 12 meters, people still don't like using high impact autos despite this massive range difference because of subjective field preferences. And so as a result, you can make the argument that range gaps between archetypes within the same weapon family are essentially non-existent, especially when you move to other weapon families where the gap's even smaller. Hand cannons are all within like 5-6 meters. Pulse rifles are all, again, within like 5-6 meters. Scouts are essentially all infinite, sidearms are within 2 meters, SMGs are within 2 meters. The gap between them is very, very small, meaning that the difference between different archetypes comes down to other things. For example, like lightweight stat bonuses, or for example, the mag dump time of a weapon, or for example, the feel of a weapon, how clunky it feels to use. For example, think about like a high impact pulse in PvE, feels very awkward to use. So all primaries in every single archetype family were balanced around their top performer in terms of DPS. So usually we're looking at something like a rapid fire frame or a more modern heavy burst frame. We're going to anchor around those like we did with the special and power weapons, and then scale downward based on inherent archetype disadvantages, including in some cases minor range differences, but that's not the biggest factor or the only factor that's being taken into account here. Now, top performers of every single archetype were then ranked based on ease of use, relevant range capability, overall feel, elite scaling, recoil, base reload, and other miscellaneous factors. They're also based around weapons that currently feel healthy in the sandbox. We talked about this before, but specifically hand cannons. Hand cannons are, I think, the most balanced primary right now. They do solid elite DPS, they feel like they belong in their range tier, they have some mechanical skill to use compared to some other primary archetypes, which makes them a little less forgiving in terms of their precision requirements, but allows you to get higher minor DPS as a result. I think hand cannons are the most balanced primary right now. So we actually haven't really touched hand cannons. In fact, we've touched other primaries instead and built our primary damage models around hand cannons specifically. Now, what does the ranking end up actually being when you rank all of these individual weapon families based on ease of use, range, etc.? We decided that it was something like this. Sidearms should go above SMGs because sidearms are in the similar range tier to SMGs, but SMGs feel a lot more spammable, higher fire rate, more forgiving. Sidearms, you got to turn your camera a lot more, and they have a more strict precision requirement. SMGs should go over pulses because pulses are relatively easy to use and long range, but pulses, bows, and hand cannons can all occupy kind of the same tier. Hand cannons are here because they have high elite scaling, so it's okay that they have similar DPS to pulse rifles, despite pulse rifles being way safer to use. And bows are a little bit clunky to use, they're a little bit awkward to use compared to other traditional primaries, and because they feel that way, I'm willing to give bows a little bit of a higher placement here in terms of overall minor DPS. Also, bows have really poor elite scaling, so I think them being kind of in the same tier as hand cannons and pulses in terms of minor DPS is okay. Finally, in the bottom two tiers, we have autos and scouts. So far it's sidearms, SMGs, and then pulses, bows, hand cannons in one tier, and then autos below that because autos are like SMGs except they're longer range, so they're even more forgiving and easy to use. And then scouts. Scouts are like the sit back, relax, blink away weapon, so they should have the lowest minor DPS because they have the highest range and the safest general playstyle. So the goal is here. I didn't talk about our specific goals, but we have two goals here. Number one, the gaps between archetypes from lowest to highest should never exceed 20% or so. The current gap, for example, between lightweight sidearms and precision sidearms, if we scroll down here, is 30.6k to 18.5k. That is a 71% damage difference between two archetypes of the same weapon family. I want you to let that sink in. There are two archetypes. Imagine if this happened to a special weapon family or a power weapon family, by the way. Imagine if adaptive heavy GLs and rapid fire heavy GLs were separated by a 71% DPS difference, right? I feel like this is something no one talks about, but this is just kind of insane to me when I first saw this. The difference between two primary archetypes is 71%. That just can't be allowed, right? So I'm going to minimize that on every single primary family to 20% at most. That's my goal. My second goal is the gap between the highest and the lowest primary weapon classes should not exceed around 55%. The current gap is between lightweight SMGs and lightweight sidearms. Lightweight SMGs doing approximately 17.9k minor DPS and lightweight sidearms doing around 30.6k. And the gap here is 71%. So I want to close that. Not only will SMGs not be the bottom tier option they are right now anyway, but I want that gap to close to around 55%. Okay, so those are my two numerical goals. So with that out of the way, let's talk about my summary of every change that I made to the primary sandbox, starting with auto rifles. Now, auto rifles are a mid-range option. They're easy to use, spray and pray, body shot weapon, which is why they're the second lowest damage tier out of all the primaries here. However, I'm not a big fan of like nerfing weapons that currently feel okay, and I think most people would agree that the support frame auto feels pretty balanced right now. So it actually turns out that based on my damage calculations, the support frame auto doesn't even need to change. We're just going to move all the other archetypes within the auto rifle family up a little bit so that support frame autos aren't such a huge outlier. Because it doesn't make sense for a brand spanking new auto rifle archetype that is capable of healing teammates and giving them a 10% global damage buff is also the highest damage profile archetype that there is. Obviously, projectile travel time and the kind of difficulty of using that playstyle should be compensated for a little bit on the damage front, but I still don't think support frame autos should be the highest minor DPS auto rifle archetype in the game. So as a result, we've scaled up a couple of archetypes here. Adaptives are up by 5.5%, high impacts are up by 5.1%, lightweights and rapids, I guess they're kind of the same archetype, are up by 2%, and finally precisions are up by 6.4%. This addresses the problem of support frame autos feeling like too much of a positive outlier compared to other autos, leaving them left behind in the dust. Now, all of the auto rifles kind of feel mostly the same, with some of them receiving a nice quality of life small little damage buff, but the support frame doesn't necessarily power creep all the other archetypes as much as it used to. Next up, we have bows. Now, bows have infinite range. They're a little less straightforward to use versus like scouts, but in exchange, they have better per shot damage, which we talked about why that's favorable, and they have better close range compatibility compared to scouts, which are like, you gotta like hip fire them close range if they're not gonna be awkward. So bows are a lot nicer to use universally in engagements. So I gave bows a proportional boost to match their new damage tier, which is like the pulse and hand cannon damage tier. So all archetypes have received a 30% damage buff. The result of this should be that bows should feel a little bit nicer to use, and they're more likely to one-shot enemies in higher level content, which is certainly nice to have. Next up, we have hand cannons. Hand cannons are like a mid-range, more skilled option versus like auto rifles, but they have punishing base reload and they have great elite scaling, which is a big difference versus auto rifles. I think hand cannons, like I said, are mostly fine as is. The archetypes are largely healthy. In my opinion, though, given what I'm going to do to SMGs in a little bit here, not to spoil anything, but potentially buff their elite scaler to make them more of a specialist primary. I'm a big fan of changing primaries so that they have these little special niches that they all fill, so that they all feel more distinct and not just products of whatever range tier that they exist in. They should be more diverse than just being this primary has this range value and so it should do this amount of damage, right? So we're kind of analyzing primaries by the list of factors that I was talking about earlier, right? Whether we're talking about engagement range, ease of use, overall feel, elite scaling, recoil, base reload, all this stuff. I want primaries to have more factors by which you can measure them and more factors by which we can diversify them to make the sandbox feel a little bit more pleasant to play in. So again, potentially buff their elite scaler to differentiate them more from stuff like SMGs, and also potentially buff aggressive frame base reload. It's really low. It's really low, feels really awful, big outlier compared to the other members of the hand cannon family. Next up, we have pulse rifles. So pulse rifles, they're a mid to long range kind of safe pick, generally easy to hit their crit requirements, kind of awkward to use closer range, but they are generally a pretty safe option to use. So I wanted to rein in the overperforming heavy burst. This is one of the only overall nerfs that I've made in this sandbox that's quite significant. I've decreased their damage by about 16%, so they do 84.1% of their former minor DPS, and this brings them a lot closer to the other pulse rifle archetypes. It makes no sense that the highest range and relatively easy to use, might I add, archetype, brand spanking new in the sandbox, should do more DPS than like a rapid fire pulse with lower range. Makes absolutely no sense. So I reined them in a little bit because of their range. They're still pretty good, right? If we look at their minor DPS, it's still like 22.3k, which is like middle of the pack for pulse rifles, but they don't absolutely overpower and power creep the rest of the pulse rifle family, specifically rapid fires, which I think should be the highest DPS option for pulse rifles. Now, we've also rescaled the other pulse rifles to have equal gaps between archetypes. The problem I had earlier was that there was this huge disproportionate gap. In fact, why don't we look at it right now? There's this huge disproportionate gap between certain archetypes, right? Rapid fire pulse way above the rest. Heavy burst pulse way above the rest. Lightweight sidearm way above the rest. There's a big difference between archetypes, and I didn't like that. I want to make it so that all the spacing between all the archetypes is equal, fair, mathematically justifiable, just like we did with special weapons. Now, the problem with primaries is that you really only have range to go off of. You don't really have total damage, so you have to kind of balance off of other factors. Makes it a little bit more subjective, but in my opinion, I do want all of the archetypes within a single weapon type to feel not like so horribly different from each other. That's my main goal. So even if I get some of these sub rankings wrong, like maybe some people think, you know, lightweight pulses should actually be below high impact pulses or above high impact pulses, but I did it in the other way. At least the archetype differential in terms of DPS between them is so small now that it actually doesn't matter that much, right? The feel, the effect is not going to be that much different. Let's go back to our pulse rifle tab here. I've rescaled the pulse rifles to fit more with the new heavy burst kind of target. Adaptive pulses got a 0.7% damage increase. I know, very precise. Aggressive burst pulses, I've scaled them down a little bit to 98.5% of their former damage. High impact pulses, I buffed them by 1.5%. And legacy PR55 / lightweight pulses, I have decreased their damage by around like 1.5%. So very small changes to pulses. Just wanted to bring them in line so that all of their archetype differentials are like very small. And then obviously heavy bursts, I nerf them a lot. The result of this should be that pulses should still feel absolutely decent to use post buff. If you guys liked using rapid fire pulses after Bungie buffed them, rapid fire pulses are remaining the exact same. In fact, I've balanced the rest of the pulses around rapid fire pulses, so all the pulses should feel pretty good next to rapid fire pulses. Heavy burst pulses shouldn't be the crazy front runner anymore, given their relative ease of use and long range of 37 meters, right? Pretty crazy. Next up, we have scout rifles. So scout rifles, they're extremely safe, they're long range, slow playstyle option. However, I wanted to give them a proportional buff to their underperforming archetypes. I think rapid fire scouts, in terms of their minor DPS, 19.9k is actually not that bad in the grand scheme of things. However, the other scout rifle archetypes, especially stuff like aggressives and high impacts, definitely feel a little weak. So I gave them a small proportional buff, so the gap between archetypes is a little bit smaller. Aggressives got 4%, high impacts got 3.6%, lightweights got 6.5%, and precisions got a 5% buff, and this makes the gap between all of these archetypes essentially equal. After this patch, scout rifles should feel mostly the same, but I don't think rapids really needed a buff, and so that's why I gave a small quality of life damage buff to all of the remaining scout rifle archetypes. Now, sidearms, this is where you're going to see a lot of difference here. Sidearms are the most risky range tier. They have more mechanical input required than SMGs and less forgiveness on crits. They're a lot easier to miss with than SMGs in my opinion. SMGs are a lot more spray and pray. So as a result, they should have the highest damage profile in the game. However, there's an absolutely massive amount of variance here between sidearm archetypes that I wanted to address. So first of all, I don't think lightweights should be the highest DPS sidearm archetype. They're very easy to use. They have high move speed, high handling. They have good base stats. There's no reason why lightweights should be the highest DPS archetype. It should be something else like the rapid fire. So I've adjusted all of the sidearm archetypes to be more in parity with lightweights, and so that they have a little bit of a difference between archetypes, but nowhere near the same amount as whatever this is. Well, this is just a mess, right? It shouldn't be happening. So let's go ahead and talk about what I did to sidearms in particular. Adaptive sidearms received a 13.2% buff. Adaptive burst sidearms got a 14.1% buff. Heavy burst sidearms got a 21.8% buff. Rapid fire sidearms got a 25.1% buff. And these two massive outliers, which we talked about before, lightweights and precisions. Lightweights got a 91.5% per shot change, so they're, I guess, minus 9%, minus 8%. And precision sidearms got a 42.7% buff. So what does that actually look like when all is said and done? Let's go ahead and look at post changes. So pre-changes, you can see all these green dots are individual sidearm archetypes, extremely spaced out. We go to post changes, what do we see? They're in a nice little cloud here with rapids at the top, then adaptive burst, then heavy burst, then lightweight, then adaptive, then precision as being the longest range archetype. So nice little cloud here, just barely reaching into where the SMGs are, and we're going to talk about SMGs in just a second. So SMGs. SMGs are in the same risky range tier as sidearms, but they're generally way easier to use and more forgiving spray and pray than sidearms. However, because they still occupy that same risky range tier that sidearms do, they should still have that strong aggressive damage profile they were known for in the earlier years of Destiny, and so I gave them a blanket buff to match this new tier. Now, you know what's kind of mind-blowing? I gave lightweight sidearms a 50%, 50. I don't think Bungie has ever made like a 50% damage increase to any archetype in the history of their patch notes. But let's say they were radical enough to give lightweight sidearms a 50% damage buff. This just barely edges out pre-nerf heavy burst pulse rifles. I want you to let that sink in. SMGs are so bad today that they have a 50% difference. I give them a 50% damage buff to the strongest SMG archetype, and it barely edges out a pulse rifle that is in a range tier that's like twice the range of its own. So that's how bad SMGs are right now. It's pretty crazy. So anyways, to balance them out, adaptive SMGs 50.1%, aggressive SMGs around 54%, lightweight SMGs 50%, and precision SMGs. For some reason, precision SMGs, by the way, are like, I don't know, they were performing a little high for their RPM and their range. So I gave them a little bit less of about 43.5%. One more thing. I think we should potentially decrease the elite scalar of SMGs. This elite scalar, this damage to majors here, this was only being held in check by the fact that SMGs were really, really poor performers in terms of minor DPS. Now that we're increasing their damage overall, I think we should decrease their elite scalar to compensate for the fact that hand cannons should occupy that niche, at least in my opinion. Right? Otherwise, you know, there's kind of like not really a reason to use hand cannons outside of their slightly longer range and maybe like subjective field preferences. So what's the result of this? SMGs will no longer feel like wet noodles. There's still some segmentation between archetypes. You know, it's more logical. Precisions won't be like second in sustained DPS for whatever reason. So yeah, I think that'll feel a little bit more balanced. And you can see here, SMGs now occupy this second damage tier rather than being all the way at the bottom. What are the overall results of my primary changes? Sidearms, SMGs, and bows are receiving large buffs at 14.09%, 49.34%, and 30% on average respectively. Pulses are receiving a small nerf overall, 3% on average, with heavy burst taking the biggest toll, like 16% or something like that. Everything else remains kind of the same or has like a small buff. So auto's got like a 3% buff overall, hand cannon 0, scout rifles 4%. It's, you know, mostly the same for the other stuff. As you can see here though, if we compare the pre versus post patch, pre-patch, you have huge swings. Let me actually get rid of the special weapons to make this more clear. Pre-patch, you have huge swings in damage between archetypes. Now, if we look at post-patch, much nice, tighter clusters of groups here. The only kind of major difference here, I would say, is probably like precision hand cannons. The reason why I kept 180 RPM hand cannons up here is because a lot of people still hate them, despite the fact that they are like an outlier amongst the other hand cannons. So, you know, I'll take it or leave it. Maybe I'll adjust it in the future when people kind of change their sentiment around precision hand cannons, because they are pretty strong. But regardless, you can see here there's much tighter groupings of primary families with not too many outliers. You can see that there's like clusters, you know, like here, you know, here. They're all like individually quite distinct on this graph. And finally, there's also equal band gaps between functions in terms of primaries, in terms of risk, right? So from a game development, from a game design perspective, you want your weapons to be balanced on this kind of risk reward curve. And that was very clear when we looked at stuff like special weapons, when we looked at stuff like power weapons, but we don't really have like a 2D graph like we did with special and power weapons. However, you can see here that there's like kind of 3 distinct tiers here, right? So we have this and we have this, right? You have stuff like autos and scouts occupying the bottom tier because they're the safest playstyle. You have hand cannons, you have bows, and you have pulse rifles occupying the middle tier because they're kind of that middle risk area. And then you have sidearms and you have SMGs, which occupy the highest tier because they are the riskiest to use. You also now have equal gaps between archetypes. I want you guys to take a moment and I guess appreciate kind of what I've done here between every single archetype. The gap between here and here, the gap between here and here, the gap between here and here, the gap between here and here. They're all equal. Gap between here and here, the gap between here and here, the gap between here and here, they're all equal. All of my changes, the reason why all of these numbers are so precise is because the gap between all archetypes is now just that equal. Look at that. All of these gaps, if you look horizontally, they're all the exact same distance from each other, right? Look at SMGs, 1, 2, 3, same difference, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. So these are all kind of calculated so that they're all the same percentage difference between all these different archetypes. Now the order can be subjective, the order can be argued, but again, I've minimized this gap so much that even if you want to argue that one archetype should be higher DPS than the other because it, you know, it feels worse than the other one, so it should be compensated in turn, the difference is small enough that it doesn't actually matter that much anymore. I'm pretty happy with how these things turned out. There's a solid like kind of 3-tier formation here, which I was really kind of seeking before. That was one of the goals. And in terms of like the difference between the bottom and the top, right, you have rapid fire scouts versus something like a rapid fire sidearm. This gap has closed to something like 50%. And if you want to talk about the gap between one archetype, you know, the lowest performing member and the highest performing member, that gap has also closed successfully as well. So that's pretty much it for primaries. These are all the changes I have kind of to make here. Let's go ahead and look at the changes graphs one more time. If you guys want to take a look at them, here's like the summary, right? Post, pre. Sure, well, you know what? Let's drop in the power weapons here as well. This is, I don't know, this is probably one of the coolest graphing projects I've ever made. I've literally found a way to represent the entire Destiny 2 weapon sandbox visually on a graph, with every single archetype and you can see all the changes that I made, mostly positive, some negative in terms of damage profiles. Yeah, really cool stuff. I don't know, this is just pretty awesome. I'm probably going to link a publicly accessible tableau that you can check out, and you can, you know, hide certain weapons, look at certain weapons, experience the damage profiles yourself. A couple things before I go. Oversights in my project. Number one, all primaries here were based on max reload manual reloads, whereas specials and heavies were based on infinite firing. There's probably a way to more accurately assess primaries versus specials and heavies, but for the most part, I think people understand that the primary sandbox and the special/heavy sandbox are kind of separate outside of trace rifles and rocket sidearms. And I think trace rifles and rocket sidearms having like essentially simulated infinite firing is not like a huge deal, because generally rocket sidearm reload is really fast and you don't really tend to reload unless you're between engagements because they have pretty big mag sizes. Same thing for trace rifles, right? So not a big deal. Number two, I didn't really account for the possibility of scalar adjustments or fire rate changes. Yes, I did talk about elite scalar reductions on stuff like SMGs and increases on stuff like hand cannons, but I didn't really go into it as much as I could have, right? I could have really looked at every single minor elite boss scalar on every single weapon and been like, okay, yeah, we can, you know, we can put a drop of this here, you know, make the minor scalar 10% higher, make this scalar like, you know, 30% lower, whatever. I didn't really do that. I only did it when it like stood out to me, which is maybe in the future, if I ever update this video or come out with like a, you know, Sandbox updates part 2 or something, we could maybe go over scalars, but I don't think scalars are like a huge deal right now. I think for the most part, you're looking at minor damage and you're looking at boss damage. And when you're looking at minor damage, you're looking at machine guns, primaries, rocket sidearms, traces, maybe some breach GL archetypes like waveframes and area denials, right? That's it. And we looked at it like that already, so not a big deal. And number two, you're looking at boss damage for other stuff, right? So it's kind of what it is, right? And then honestly, like adjusting the overall damage of a weapon without touching the scalars is generally not a problem, right? It's only a problem on stuff like SMGs, which I talked about because they overshadow hand cannons, but that's pretty much it. And finally, number three, I could, I guess, include suggestions for new and interesting intrinsic bonuses. So what I mean by that is not like a new frame like the support frame. I'm talking like a reason to pick archetypes that's outside of damage profiles. So rapid fire frame, you obviously get like that increased reload after you hit 0 in the mag, but I think that's like a pretty mediocre, I don't know, like archetype bonus. Aggressive shotguns have a thing where like if you kill an ad, you get like increased fire rate. You know, stuff like that can be like potentially kind of interesting on like primaries or something like that. So, you know, maybe a more interesting reason to pick these, maybe like bringing their damage profiles closer together, but making the frames themselves more interesting might be a possibility that I'm willing to address in the future. Now, overall suggestions moving forward, this is just, you know, just general ideas, paradigms that I'd like to throw out there because it's just based on my experience after like looking through all of these options and seeing all these patterns between all these different weapon archetypes. There's a couple things I'd like to talk about. So number one, please fix waveframe scaling, right? So whether we're talking compressed waves, you know, special waveframes, and more specifically waveframe swords like Ergo and Summum Bonum, please fix waveframe scaling. You can nerf waveframes. I'm okay with that. They are a little bit overtuned right now. Sure, nerf them by 5%, whatever you want to do, but please fix scaling. Make them work in fire teams when everybody's using them. I do want to see waveframes on multiple bosses. That would be nice. Number two, I think balance should be more based on an equal viability approach. I'm not sure how much time and money and effort Bungie spends with their Sandbox team investing into a resource like this, where you can visually see the sandbox and be like, oh, this archetype is overperforming objectively based on this map, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if they do this or not, but if they do, I think balancing based on an equal viability approach, rather than, you know, having these outliers that stick out and like hammering them down one by one at a time, might be more beneficial to the sandbox. I'm not really sure, like in terms of a game direction perspective, I'm not really sure how that kind of factors in, but at least, you know, to my ears, to my hands, to my eyes playing this game, I think balancing based on this kind of equal viability approach where we're trying to approach these flat lines between different archetypes within a single weapon family is probably a more beneficial way of looking at things, rather than introducing like, let's make a heavy burst frame and just make it better than everything else in the same archetype, like, or in the same weapon family. Like, obviously that's probably not, it kind of invalidates past weapons, right? It's kind of like a form of like mini sunsetting, I suppose. But yeah, that's another thing. Number three, players have shown themselves to respond positively to pseudo-exotic effects from intrinsics. For example, support frame auto, great. Area denial, great. Micro missile, great. These are all great ideas. And I think moving away from the traditional understanding of Bungie archetypes is a good thing. Just kind of do it with caution and make sure that, for example, support frame autos, they are great. right? They might be projectile based, but they, you know, heal your teammates, cure your teammates, whatever. They give them a damage buff, but they should not have all of that and then also be the best auto rifle archetype in the game in terms of damage. These new archetypes with these new bonuses are certainly nice, but I don't think it makes sense to introduce them as like the top of the pack in terms of damage profile if they have other secondary effects that are also very game changing and very strong. I don't know how much the development cost is. I would assume it's quite high to make something like a new frame that has like special properties that isn't like just, oh, it fires faster or it's a new RPM or something like that. But I can imagine it's quite expensive, but you know, players do like it a lot, right? It's a good change to the game. So yeah, keep doing more of that if you can. And finally, number 4, I think expanding more upon weapon identities to further solidify why you'd use a weapon outside of champion mods or range is a good idea, right? Current intrinsics, mostly a non-factor, but if you can make it so that people have a reason to use, I want to say primaries are like the biggest offender of this, but like people have a reason to use weapons outside of just, oh, it's a long range engagement, I'm gonna use a scout rifle, or oh, it's a mid-range engagement, I'm gonna use this, right? If people have a reason to use weapons that makes them truly unique, right? Maybe hand cannons are like champ melters, right? They're really good at elite scaling, which they are, but if you can kind of lean into that even more, if you can make it not just about engagement range, but make archetypes and weapon families that are interesting just inherently because they have like a unique function that they can provide to the sandbox, then I think that's also a really positive change that players will respond very favorably towards. That's pretty much all I have for this video. If you want to see the summary of all the changes that I am proposing here, they are all in the endgame analysis spreadsheet in the experimental tab. You can see the change in actual damage per shot. You can see the change in total damage. Let me reset this filtering here before I forget. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This is a really long video. I'm hopefully going to edit this to be under 2 hours. This is like my first try at something like this. It's pretty cool, I think. I think this is probably like, yeah, the coolest project I've ever worked on. Was a blast. I hope you guys enjoy this content. It's really long, so hopefully you do. And after this, we're going to get back to, I say this a lot, but we're going to get back to our regularly scheduled programming. We're going to work on damage testing and come up with some cool rotations, do some testing. So yeah, I'll see you guys later, and thanks for watching.